pardon power. We need to protect it as well. For those reasons, I further object, Mr. President. Thank you.
The senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I ask permission to display on my colleague's desk my office supply of ground coffee.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise to speak about a vote that we will cast in a few hours with respect to President Trump's imposition of a 50% tariff on all goods coming from Brazil. President Trump's tariff regime, global tariffs, Brazilian tariffs, Canadian tariffs, tariff deals announced, then paused, tariff deals negotiated, exceptions granted, and in some cases not granted, have created huge chaos in the national economy. 3 universities looked at the Virginia economy in the last month, and a summary of those 3 universities' reports was published in a Virginia publication last week titled "Virginia's GDP Growth Drops from 6.2% to 1.7%. And the analysis of this precipitous decline, 75% decline nearly, in the Virginia GDP in the first year of Donald Trump's presidency, cited a number of factors: mass layoffs of federal employees and contractors, cancellation of highly valued economic development projects, clawback of research funding and other programmatic funding, but importantly, a key component affecting the Virginia economy and the national economy right now is the president's chaotic tariff regime. Tariffs are a tax on American consumers. Tariffs are a tax on American businesses, and they are a tax that is imposed by a single person, Donald J. Trump. In Virginia, we are seeing, and nationally, we are seeing the effects of the Trump economy, and it was well summarized in one of the reports I referenced. Fewer jobs, jobs declining, higher prices, whether it's food, building supplies, energy, healthcare, higher prices, and slower growth. I want to talk about one aspect of this economic malpractice, the imposition of tariffs, and in particular, the imposition of tariffs on Brazil. The president has imposed a tariff on Brazil of 50% on all the products that the United States imports from Brazil. I want to get to Brazil and the tariffs and the effect it's having on American consumers in a minute, but first, what is the power that the president cites enabling him to put such a sizable tariff on Brazilian products? What he cites is a statute called IEPA, dealing with international economic emergencies, and that is a statute that passed by Congress, signed into law decades ago, allowing the president under some circumstances to take actions following the declaration of an international emergency. What is an international emergency? The IEPA statute, 50 U.S.C. section 1701, says that the emergency that a president must declare is any unusual and extraordinary threat which has its source in whole or substantial part outside the United States, the threat being to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States if the president declares a national emergency with respect to such threat. So the 50% tariff on all products from Brazil is justified by President Trump declaring that Brazil represents a national security threat. Mr. President, the 50% tariff was imposed in 2 actions. The president imposed global tariffs on most nations in the world in April and imposed a 10% tariff on Brazil in that action, but then added an additional 40% in a ruling from the White House at the end of July, combining to be a 50% tariff. Now, Mr. President, you have followed President Trump's logic on tariffs. The global tariffs that were imposed because he claims that other nations are ripping America off in trade. Other nations are ripping America off in trade. They are selling us more of their stuff and not buying enough of our stuff. And the president says that's a ripoff. I disagree with him on whether or not that's a ripoff, but you would have a hard time making a case that Brazil is ripping off the United States in trade. We have a trade surplus with Brazil. Many of the other nations that the president has imposed tariffs on, there is a trade deficit as measured by goods. The president usually doesn't look at the deficit in goods and services. If you look at both, the picture actually looks much better for the United States. But Brazil, we have a trade surplus with Brazil of nearly $7 billion in goods and nearly $23 billion in services annually. Last year, the trade surplus we had with Brazil was $30 billion. They buy $30 billion more of our stuff than we buy of their stuff. So that makes Brazil a very unusual subject or target of a tariff regime designed to stop other nations from ripping us off. So if that's not the emergency, if we're in trade surplus with Brazil, if that's not the emergency, why is the president declaring that there's an emergency with Brazil that warrants taxing American consumers by raising the price of any goods brought in from Brazil by 50%? This has got to be, Mr. President, the most unusual use of IEEPA in American history. It is the most extreme and illogical declaration of an emergency in American history. And that's saying a lot, Mr. President, because President Trump declared an energy emergency on day one of his tenure, even though America was producing more energy than any time in the history of the United States. Oil, gas, wind, solar, battery storage. We are the leaders in the world in energy production, but President Trump declared an energy emergency so he could give an easy pass lane around environmental regulations to oil, gas, and coal projects. So I thought that emergency declaration was pretty extreme, but I got a more extreme one. President Trump is unhappy that Brazil is prosecuting a friend of his. The former president of Brazil, on his way out the door, inspired a lot of people to try to protest and even overturn the peaceful transfer of power when he lost an election. And so Brazil is prosecuting him under Brazilian laws. When the president heard that former President Bolsonaro was being prosecuted, he threatened 50% tariffs if you don't stop the Bolsonaro witch hunt trial. How is that trial an emergency for the United States? How is that trial a threat to American national security or our economy? The president's mad that a friend of his is being prosecuted. How is that an emergency? We went on. As the trial got underway in the middle of July, Fox News, Trump calls for immediate end to unjust trial of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro. Unjust trial. I don't think President Trump is a lawyer, and I know he's not a Brazilian lawyer. I doubt he has an expertise in Brazilian law. By what right would he call that trial unjust? By what right would he claim that the trial of this president for trying to inspire the overturn of power, by what right would he claim that that's an emergency for the United States? President Trump wasn't done by making these demands and threatening tariffs. He had his administration take another step, highly unusual. U.S. sanctions Brazilian judge for prosecuting Trump ally Bolsonaro. It's the end of July. I'm threatening tariffs. I'm claiming that the prosecution is unjust. The United States even used sanctions power that Donald Trump has the unilateral ability to use to sanction the judge presiding over the case. Go back to the definition that I read you earlier. How is a prosecution of a potential Brazilian lawbreaker an unusual or extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, or economy of the United States? I would assert, Mr. President, if we allow President Trump to declare this prosecution an emergency, we will have given any president a completely blank check to invent an emergency and do whatever they want and bypass Congress for doing so. This is not an emergency, and that's why I have filed with other senators a resolution to terminate President Trump's emergency. But this isn't just about a misuse of executive power. It has real-life consequences. Let me just bring up one that I have to admit I'm really biased about, which is coffee. Like a lot of people in this chamber, I drink too much coffee. Americans drink just about more coffee per capita than any country in the world, and coffee imports are the most significant agricultural import we bring into the United States. I lived in a great coffee-producing country when I was a missionary, Honduras. They produce a lot of coffee. The U.S. doesn't produce so much. I think the president knows that in the United States, the only places where coffee is grown are Hawaii and Puerto Rico. Nowhere else in the United States are there conditions that allow for the growth of coffee. Sometimes we put tariffs on products coming in from other nations to grow and inspire a domestic industry. If we make, Brazilian steel more expensive, maybe we'll make more steel in the United States. I'm here to tell you that there's no amount of tariff that would turn the United States into a nation that could produce a lot of coffee. And if every bit of coffee that could be produced in Puerto Rico and Hawaii were produced, it would meet precisely 1% of the coffee that Americans drink. So we bring in coffee. And our single largest source of coffee is Brazil. 35% of American coffee comes from Brazil. The next source, Colombia, 27%. And then other nations, Vietnam produces a good bit of coffee. Other nations in Central America produce a good bit of coffee. But the real powerhouse, and I can be sure that in my office's supply of ground coffee that we use to make coffee every morning, there's a lot of Brazilian coffee in there. The real powerhouse is Brazil. After the president announced that he was going to do these tariffs, the news started up right away. The prediction, U.S. coffee drinkers and businesses will pay the price of Trump's Brazil tariff. Sometimes the president likes to say other nations pay them. No, this is a sales tax directly on those who consume the product. And that was the prediction, and the prediction turned out to be true. The tariffs went into effect at the end of July. By September 12, 6 weeks later, CNN Business, coffee prices haven't surged this much in decades. Haven't surged this much in decades. And the surging is very, very noticeable. By the end of July, coffee prices keep surging, and it's likely to get worse. By the end of July, and remember, the end of July, there was only the 10% tariff that had been imposed on Brazil in April. The extra 40% didn't kick in until the end of July. But coffee had already surged 14% at the end of July from July a year before. But I don't have the chart to show you today. The statistics just came out about September. The price of coffee, a staple in virtually every American household, has increased by 40% between September 2024 and September 2025. And every American experiences it at the grocery store when they're buying coffee, and every American experiences it when they're in coffee shops purchasing coffee. I held a roundtable with small businesses in Northern Virginia 2 Fridays ago at a tea shop out near Reston called Eldon Street Tea Shop. And I had tea shops. They're getting hit by tariffs because tea comes from nations like India and China and Vietnam. And I had coffee shops and I had chocolate shops, All of these are products that are being imported, and they're all being dramatically affected. And these small businesses said, if you have a chance, Senator, please do something. Please do something to stop this tariff madness. And so that's why I'm on the floor today. I've used coffee as an example because I didn't want to bring a side of beef in and put it on the desk. We get a lot of beef from Brazil. 50% tariffs have dramatically driven up the price of ground beef in supermarkets all over this country. People are paying more for coffee. They're paying more for beef. They're paying more for fruits and vegetables that come from nations that have been socked by Trump tariffs. People are paying more for building supplies. People are paying more for energy. People are paying more for health care. That's why the economists who looked at the Virginia economy said the Trump economy is one of higher prices, fewer jobs, and slower growth. It is my hope, Mr. President, that my colleagues will stand up for their constituents and say enough is enough. No president, Democrat or Republican, should be able to declare a national emergency justifying the imposition of 50% tariffs because a friend of theirs is being prosecuted for breaking the law in another country. If this body allows that, this body will be opening the door for untold mischief committed by future presidents who will decide, I can declare anything an emergency. And the Senate will just lay down and let me walk over them and not speak out against it. And it also is important for us to acknowledge this isn't just about an abuse of presidential power. It's about abuse of presidential power that people are feeling every time they walk down a grocery store aisle to buy coffee for their families, to buy ground beef for their families. I hope my colleagues will join me in an effort to reverse the declaration of a national emergency and save everyday people and businesses some money. With that, Mr. President, I thank you and I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Washington.